Yes, he was.
Well, we come now to the principal toast of the evening, and I'm delighted to welcome and introduce our president for this year, Professor Peter Garside. Peter was educated at Cambridge and Harvard universities and taught English literature for more than 30 years at Cardiff University, where he became Professor of English and Director of the Centre for Editorial and Intertextual Research. Subsequently, he was appointed Professor of Bibliography and Textual Studies at the University of Edinburgh, where he's now a professorial fellow. Peter has been involved in many significant and groundbreaking projects during his distinguished career, but perhaps most pertinently for us this evening, he served on the board of the Edinburgh edition of the Waverley novels. He produced 3 volumes for that edition, including Waverley. His more recent work includes editions of Scott's shorter poems, published in 2020 by Edinburgh University Press, and John Gibson Lockhart's Peter's Letters to His Kinsfolk, published in 2022, again by Edinburgh University Press. Peter has made a huge contribution to the life of our club, with his involvement stretching back, if I may say so, to last century. Rather fittingly, he wrote the introduction to our 1994 compilation of presidential addresses entitled Talking About Scott. More recently, he served as Honorary Secretary from 2010 to 2015, and then as Chairman from 2016 to 2019. Lee reports that Peter's essay on the Scott family graves is one of the most visited blogs on the club website. Peter has just finished work on a critical edition of Lockhart's Life of Scott, which he's been working on for some 4 or 5 years, and he tells me that's currently in production with Edinburgh University Press and ought to be available later this year. So from all of this, I think we can agree that Peter is absolutely steeped in the life and works of Scott, and thus eminently suited to be our president. And so I now invite Peter to give the toast to the memory of Sir Walter Scott.
Well, thank you for that most gracious introduction. In fact, Madeleine, you managed to preempt me on 3 scores, so you'll see what they were as I proceed with what I had produced beforehand. Madam Chair, lords, ladies and gentlemen, this tribute to Sir Walter, as Madeleine has already indicated, comes after 20 years of active membership of the club. First as a member, then as secretary, followed by a spell as chairperson, all of which has been exhilarating and has led me to conclude that the wide-ranging engagements of the club place it on a par in promoting knowledge of Sir Walter with those activities participated in through my parallel existence as an academic and a literary editor. In all of these spheres, however, I must confess to having had a sneaking desire to one day hold one of those roles, operating on a ceremonial rather than functional level. A few moments of supposed glory rather than hours of often solitary graft. Well, here it is at last, the distinguished thing. For people who don't recognise that, that's the novelist Henry James talking about oncoming death. Here it is at last, the distinguished thing. Mind, it's involved a long wait. When first approached as to taking on this position, I remember asking Lee Simpson if this would involve me becoming the oldest ever member, president of the club. True to form, within the hour, Lee came back with a comprehensive list of ex-presidents with dates of tenure and ages while holding the position. And, as partly anticipated, yes, it turned out that I would be so, narrowly beating by a few months Fraser Elgin, president in 2000. Being on the cusp of 84 then exceeds, to give one example, Harold Macmillan, who in his address of 1973 described himself as being at an advanced age, having just completed my 80th year. He means he's 79. All this puts into a somewhat sad perspective the case of Sir Walter himself, whose own life ended in his early 60s and whose extensive literary output was compacted in a space of 3 decades. If sometimes we're in danger of being over-dazzled by the image of a towering literary genius, it is worth reflecting for a moment on the more human side of the story. Well do I remember Dame Jean Maxwell-Scott at Abbotsford referring to the original occupant of the house as that poor man. A salutary reminder that the family's view of their ancestor might have varied in some respects from that of the public at large. While full participation of the club and its events became possible when we finally moved to Edinburgh in 2005, there were several earlier points of intersection between ourselves. One of these came when, still working at Cardiff University, and this is the second preempt from Madeleine, by the way, I was asked to write an introduction to a selection of past presidential addresses in a small volume to mark the centenary of the club in 1994. The invitation came through or via Professor Ian Campbell, but behind that I sensed the presence of David Dykes, who had examined my PhD at Cambridge, and of Dr. Archie Turnbull, president of the club that year and secretary to the Edinburgh University Press. The elegant cloth-bound volume that emerged, talking about Scott, included addresses by John Buchan, C.S. Lewis, Magnus Magnusson and others. And it bears testimony to the distinctive productive values cultivated by Archie. It was Archie, too, who was a major force in getting the Edinburgh edition of the Waverley novels off the ground, the first 3 volumes of which, including my own edition of The Black Dwarf, appeared in 1993. In all, this was a moment of peculiar buoyancy, one that made writing a fitting introduction all that much easier. Text in those days was king in academic circles, with some of the fiercer of those labelling themselves as critical theorists going up so far as to proclaim the death of the author altogether. And in this case, one was able to hold out the prospect of new editions of the Waverley novels, shorn of the incrustations of the Victorians. Yet, even so, I found it impossible to exclude the presence of Sir Walter himself. One passage from a journal entry of December 1825, the time he's facing insolvency, struck me as especially apposite. What a life mine has been. Half-educated, almost wholly neglected or left to myself, getting forward and being held a bold and clever fellow, broken-hearted for 2 years, my heart handsomely pieced again, once at the verge of ruin, yet opened up new sources of wealth almost overflowing, now taken in the pitch of my pride and nearly winged, and what is to be the end of this? Among other things, the passage is recognisable as representing one of those what-if moments, looking back at corners turned in the past, while speculating hard possibilities in the future. The same sense of uncertainty in human affairs serves as a recurrent theme in the novels, as protagonists are immersed in the dynamic currents of their era. Scott's unmistakable voice, as found here, also not only permeates writing such as the letters and journal, but can be sent throughout his imaginative work, providing an anchor for the reader. It is also a voice which can be applied to my own circumstances. To apply the what-if test to my own case, nothing in my early years would point towards a conclusion such as the present. As a schoolboy in Buxton, Derbyshire, at the heart of England, I vaguely remember one of my grandfathers having a set of the Wavy novels, but never felt any inclination to look beyond the covers. My eventual university destination, Cambridge, in the early 1960s, was hardly more propitious for arousing any budding interest in Scott. Some elder members of the senior common rooms there still no doubt recalled E.M. Forster's mocking account of the plot of The Antiquary in the lecture halls. More immediately, we were faced with the stern, if scruffy, figure of F.R. Leavis, with moral intensity and literature now being paramount. In his The Great Tradition, 1948, Leavis had reduced Scott's status to a passing footnote. He was a great and very intelligent man, but not having the creative writer's interest in literature, he made no serious attempt to work out his own form and break away from the bad tradition of the 18th century novel. Thus, the symbiotic relationship between the man and the artist was shattered at a stroke. Only when spending a year at Harvard University as a postgraduate student during 1963 to 64 did I start reading Scott. Two influences in what seemed a more open intellectual environment stand out here. The first was a module on British historical writing given by a young professor called Edgar Rosenberg, in which it became clear that Scott stood as an important fulcrum between an older style of type of historiography, charting the doings of a narrow body of public figures, and a more vital form of historical narrative, reflecting a fuller span of society and giving an impression of what it might have been like living in the times depicted. The other influence came through the purchase of an American paperback translation of George Lukács, the historical novel, the work of a Hungarian Marxist which had been available in Russian since the 1930s, which was virtually unheard of in Anglo-American circles. Lukács placed the Wavy novels at the head of a worldwide school of advanced social historical fiction. Thus, in a somewhat roundabout way, it was a European-wide perspective that ultimately led back to Scott's more immediate milieu in Scotland. Returning to the vantage point of 1994, it's amazing to see how many advances there have been since. Amongst notable contributions can be counted the completement of EEWN and the ongoing Edinburgh edition of the poetry under Alison Lumsden, one of several key practitioners in the room today. Along with allied activities, this has allowed Scott to be placed in a much firmer cultural framework at the centre of a booming publishing industry in Edinburgh, for example, or as the leading protagonist in the Scotch novel, viewed as a broader phenomenon. Gone for the most part are the tired dualities of earlier criticism. Scott as an arch-unionist, good or bad according to opinion, or as a proto-nationalist, mostly good to those proposing it. In several ways, too, Scott and the world he inhabited has become more physically present to us. Here one might point to the sterling restoration work done at Abbotsford, as well, only recently, Lee Simpson's online record of Edinburgh locations associated with Scott. If there is one large remaining area of perplexity in all this, it exists in the field of biography. And at this juncture, the figure of John Gibson Lockhart naturally looms large. While Lockhart's life of Scott by the end of the 19th century had gained the reputation of a classic literary biography, second only to Boswell's Johnson, modern critics have tended to pick fault with it, stretching from aberrations in its handling of materials to cases of outright mendacity in storytelling. It is probably, well, it isn't, third preempt from Madeleine Mackenzie, it is probably no great secret by now that for the past 5 years I've been at work on a new edition of Lockhart's Life, one which was lodged in the hands of Edinburgh University Press only last week. And if you'll bear with me, I'd like to devote the remaining part of this oration to suggesting why some revaluation might be in order. Whereas past critics have tended to assume a coherent entity in the life of Scott as a work, in fact, it's hard to think of a biography that has undergone so many transformations. The initial suggestion that Lockhart should write one originates from Scott himself, whose will states, "I do request and entreat my affectionate son-in-law, John Gibson Lockhart, who has, during all connections with me, shown me the duty and kindness of a son, to draw up such a sketch, using in that matter such letters, correspondence, and diaries as shall be found in my repositories." Terms with the publisher Robert Cadell for a work of 5 or 6 volumes were discussed during a meeting in the immediate wake of Scott's death on the 21st of September 1832. This forming part of a larger arrangement whereby Cadell would provide a loan to cover Scott's remaining debts. Family and close friends clearly welcomed Lockhart's assumption of the role of official biographer. As early as the 3rd of October, Walter Jr., Scott's elder son, was sending a batch of materials found at Abbotsford, including the Ashestiel memoirs that have hitherto served as the opening section in all published editions of the Life. All this providing grist to the mill of Lockhart's original resolve to allow Scott as much as possible to speak in his own voice, with himself serving primarily as the compiler or editor of the work. Back in their homes in London, Lockhart and his wife Sophia, Scott's elder daughter, set about conducting a larger trawl of material from various sources, with particular attention given to Scott's dispersed original letters and to anecdotal information pertaining to his formative years. The result in the family home at 24 Sussex Place, where Sophia supervised a team copying material, must have been at times chaotic. Lockhart, for his part, was under pressure from several quarters, not least from Cadell, whose own agenda differed considerably from his own. Eventually, Lockhart gave up a resolve not to commence publication until he had completed the whole. A monthly publication began in March 1837, evenly at first, but with a fracturing in the sequence with the 5th volume. The reason for this lay in the tragic death of Sophia in May 1837. That Lockhart did return to work bears witness to a capacity for endurance bordering on the self-sacrificial. The final 7th volume swelling beyond the length of others through its inclusion of large extracts from the journal. In all, the completed first edition of the Memoirs of the Life of Sir Walter Scott Bart covers 2,910 pages, comprising at a rough estimate some 875,000 words. Of this, only about a third consists of Lockhart's own narrative and recollections, the bulk of the remainder being made up of separately foregrounded materials such as the letters and journal, Scott's diary of his 1814 lighthouse voyage, and the memoirs of others. If this now seems to represent an element of overloading, it's worth bearing in mind that much of this material was entirely fresh for contemporary readers and in danger of being lost, if not so recorded. The second edition of the memoirs in 10 volumes followed in 1839 in more orderly fashion, and in the 1840s, Cadell tested a further area of the market with a double-columned 1-volume edition. The final versions of the full memoirs occurs with A.W. Pollard's 5-volume set for Macmillan in 1900 and the more splendid 10-volume Edinburgh edition of 1902-03, the latter a reflection of a high point in Scott's reputation. In general, scholars have tended to cite this larger version of the Life, though there is little agreement as to which individual edition might claim priority. A parallel line of publication is found in the case of the abridged version of the Life, first published under the title of Narrative of the Life of Walter Scott Bart, late in 1848. As with the previous version, this was initiated through financial dealings with Robert Cadell as part of a larger settlement whereby Cadell would clear debts relating to the Abbotsford estate in return for full ownership of the Scott copyrights. In all, this abridgment, including the Ashestiel memoirs, comprises some 285,000 words, making it approximately 1/3 of the larger versions of the life. Amongst omissions, the curtailment of previously foregrounded letters, either by integrating them into the main narrative or by omitting them entirely, is one outstanding feature. Another notable element is the omission of the 1814 Lighthouse Tour diary in its entirety. The two-volume structure of the work also works to Lockhart's advantage, the first volume mainly comprising memorials of others, while the second volume is vivified by his own personal recollections. Lockhart also takes advantage of the 1848 vantage point to take the family record up to his own son Walter's accession to Abbotsford and the memorialisation of Scott so far as the monument just over the road from us, inaugurated as recently as 1846. A second edition of the abridged version was published in 1853 in one-volume form, then again using the same plates as the centenary edition in 1871. In turn, the abridgment first entered the Everyman's Library in 1906 rather, subsequently appearing in 1957 with a short introduction by W.M. Parker, the last recorded printing of which was in 1969. It is this version, one suspects, that has been most used by general readers, and it is noticeable how the trajectories of almost all modern biographies of Scott follow the pattern set by the Lockhart abridgment. Which version then might realistically represent the best option for a new, fully annotated edition? In the case of the larger memoirs, a substantial part of its materials, albeit new to Lockhart's original readers, have since appeared in more accurate forms, as in the Grierson Letters, W.E.K. Anderson's Journal, and David Hewitt's edition of the Ashestiel Memoirs. Any attempt to handle this swathe of material would involve large procedural issues, should one attempt to correct such within the text, for instance, or instead use the annotation, which would inevitably lead to an endless chain of Lockhart is mistaken kind of entries. In comparison, the abridged version of 1848, our eventual choice, is relatively devoid of such encumbrances. In working on this text, I have been increasingly impressed with the vigour of its narrative, as well as with the freshness and even delicacy of Lockhart's freed up personal recollections, as when resident at Chiefswood Cottage on the Abbotsford estate with Sophia. Lockhart was also present at Abbotsford throughout the months leading up to Scott's death, and the sections dealing with Scott's mounting fragilities, his inability to recognise once familiar modern poetry, despair at not being able to resume with the pen in his study, and recourse to spiritual texts deep in his memory, are profoundly moving and often feel remarkably genuine. On the other hand, one might argue greater exposure is granted to those more suspect narrative moments, the ever-moving hand composing Waverley and Castle Street, the nighttime ride to Poulton, or Scott's alleged last words. But as I have argued elsewhere, these often carry a special emblematic significance. For those concerned with more particular forms of accuracy, the new edition will provide a range of explanatory and textual notes. But most of all, the aim is to capture afresh the dynamic connection between author and subject, teller and tale, which shapes this unique biography. And so it is the memory of Walter Scott, especially as revealed through the window provided by his son-in-law, biographer and friend Lockhart, that I ask you now to raise your glasses. Sir Walter Scott.
Sir Walter Scott.
Sir Walter Scott.